Check, check. Check 1, 2. Check, check.
Okay, looks good. Cool.
What changed in the world while you were sleeping? What happened down the street, across the country, and 3 oceans away? Since the last time you ate breakfast. Your world may not have changed much since yesterday, but our world is changing every minute, and we'll be there every morning to keep you on top of it.
You're listening to Morning Edition from NPR News.
Listen every weekday.
We are in an ironic moment in American democracy. We are more connected than ever, but we are objectively more polarized, perhaps than we've ever been. Have we ever been in a situation like that? Of course.
Think about the Civil War, the Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement, debates over the Vietnam War. All of these are moments where the American populace felt that something important was at stake, and there was a great deal of friction about the right way to move forward.
What we need to make sure, though, is that the institutions that carried us through some of those prior struggles remain strong enough to get us through this.
The University of Virginia was created in the cradle of democracy by those who founded our democracy. It has continued to be the place to go to study current democratic issues.
The Democracy Initiative is a brand new cross-university initiative. It's going to bring together the best assets at the University of Virginia. That's going to give us the opportunity to bring diverse perspectives, whether it's someone from anthropology, politics, economics, the law school, and bringing the best of their experience to bear on these complex challenges. We want to engage with the public as well. One of the most exciting ways we'll do that will be the Presidential Ideas Festival. The Ideas Festival will bring leaders from public policy from around the world, including a past United States president, to better understand the challenges that confront us, but also how we can move forward.
In order to keep these institutions of government strong, we have to keep asking questions of our democracy.
Our country is not inevitable. It is reliant upon our engagement and our commitment to it.
Good luck, guys.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the joint session of the Global Pathfinder Summit and the Presidential Ideas Festival. I am Ben Dendy. I serve as Vice Chair of the 2019 commemoration, American Evolution. American Evolution is commemorating the 400th anniversary of events that happened in 1619 Virginia that still have an impact today, including the meeting at Jamestown of the first representative legislative assembly in the New World. Both the Global Pathfinder Summit and Presidential Ideas Festival are a part of a year-long series of events that commemorate 400 years of American democracy. During the past 400 years, we have had many teachable moments. So it is fitting that our panel discussion is on teachable moments, education, and the spread of democracy. Educational institutions at all levels contribute to democracy, not only by teaching young people about democratic values and practices, but by providing them with the experiences that model effective civic engagement and the skills to participate in a democratic society. To discuss education institutions and democracy, I would like to introduce our moderator, Margot Rogers, Senior Advisor to the University of Virginia President Jim Ryan, and former Chief of Staff to Secretary of Education Arne Duncan. Our panelists for this session include Yoni Applebaum, Senior Editor at The Atlantic, Derek Mitchell, who served as U.S. Ambassador to Myanmar from 2012 to 2016, and currently serves as President of the National Democratic Institute. Daniel Twining, President of the International Republican Institute, and former Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator John McCain. And Christina Johnson, Chancellor of the State University of New York and former Undersecretary of Energy in President Obama's administration. Thank you and enjoy the panel discussion.
Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's delightful to be in the company of these wonderful panelists to talk about an issue I know we all believe is of critical importance. And on the heels of our university's final exercises this weekend, I can think of no better time to talk about this compelling issue, education and democracy. Both raise fundamental questions about access, and it is in the integration of the two where we discover important and interesting issues. So I want to dive right in because this is a weighty topic and we have limited time together. And start with maybe a fact-finding question. I think many of us assume that the robust democracy, in fact, increases with the level of education that citizens have. And you can define education widely for the purposes of this question. But the notion of an educated citizenry has been fundamental to our nation since the beginning, even as we've expanded the notion of who citizens are. And yet we live in a time when, at least in the United States, we have a record high school graduation rate and we have pretty low voter turnout. Both of those are proxies for education and for democracy. And I'm curious then what that means. What are the facts? Is there in fact a correlation between higher levels of education among citizens and better participation in a sort of robust democracy?
Well, I think there is. We know that individuals that have some sort of college education are, twice as likely to vote and do, be participants in society. I think we step back and we say, what is the brand of the United States of America? It's equal opportunity. What's the path to equal opportunity? It's access to a quality education. So I think that you start with that premise and you go from there, and I think a lot of it is certainly K through 12, but also in higher ed.
I would also say it's a type of education that you get is important. In a democracy, you have to be able to analyze. You have to analyze facts. You have to understand how to think, as well as just basic facts of things. Jefferson talked about the necessity of having basic mathematics and writing and such. But the other thing is, democracy is, we talk about citizenship as being the most important job in a democracy. That's a job. That's not just broad general education. That's a particular type of education. When you're a doctor, you study medicine. In order to become a doctor, to be a citizen, you need to learn how to be a citizen in some way. I think we're lucky in America we have the culture of democracy that helps us along. Yeah. But if we don't learn the basics of civics, we don't put it in action, not just learn it from a book or in a classroom, but put it in action every day and do it in our daily lives and understand not just the rights that we have, but the responsibilities we have as citizens, then we won't have the civic participation we need in democracy. So it's a type of education, I think, that's important.
The right to education is fundamental. Andy Card, the former White House Chief of Staff, was reminding me last night as we came down from Monticello that the Massachusetts Constitution, which he claims is the oldest constitution in the United States, there may be some Virginians who contest these facts. He said that in addition to obviously participatory democracy, it also mandated the right to education, that such was the link among that part of founding America between citizenship and popular democracy.
I'm going to answer that with a little story, which is that when I was a boy, I was a huge baseball fan, and I would run downstairs in the morning. Back then, you'd get your sports scores printed in ink on paper, and I'd go out to the doorstep to grab it and read the box score, and I was so excited when I came up for my first little league at-bat, and I whiffed. I had no idea what I was doing. I knew all the rules. I had a great baseball education, but I had to swing the bat a few thousand times. And so when we talk about education, I think we need to differentiate between these two things, right? There's the knowing the rules and understanding how the system works, and then there's swinging the bat a few thousand times.
May I comment on that? Because I think that's a really interesting story. Not that you whiffed the ball, but
We learned too much about it.
I know, right? But what's interesting, we just got this data, it's kind of hot off the press, where we looked at working with the Department of Labor in New York State, the difference in salaries between students who had an applied learning experience, an internship, and apprenticeship, and not. So overall, students who had that, who graduated, they were about 2% on average better paid. But what was stunning is 3 different areas. It was business, computer science, and math, and performing arts. It was substantially higher, like anywhere between $10,000 a year and $23,000 a year difference for getting the ability not to whiff the ball. So you're onto something there.
So let's talk a little bit about that notion of practice and what that means. I was talking to some friends last year, and we were talking about this topic, and we were sort of hypothesizing that once the rights to Hamilton were released and every middle and high school in the country could perform Hamilton, we really had to think deeply about how it is one goes about practicing, because merely talking about it or sitting in civics, which as we know is required in some states and isn't in others, is not enough. So let's talk a little bit about how one goes about that, and would love to hear examples domestically but also globally, how people are going about the process of practicing democracy and helping particularly young people practice democracy.
When you're staying at home, Parkland students, we kind of were amazed at how civically minded they were and how articulate and how they went out and were so active, but that wasn't by chance. I mean, Florida had mandatory civics education in middle school, and you had to take an exam at the end of 7th grade to do this. So you have people that have, and it wasn't just, school in books, taking tests. They were doing it in action. They had to do things in mock trials and going out in the communities and doing things and exercising. We talk about the exercise of democracy. You have to exercise it. So, that by doing that, I think, you see the results. People actually get involved in their community. So just looking at home in Parkland, you can see the results of civic-minded and civic education. And overseas, we see it over and over in many, many different countries, where young people are just passionate. They want to be involved. The problem is the older people are keeping them from being involved. They're closing off that space. And so what we do is try to give people opportunity, young people opportunity to engage, and if you just give them a little space, they take it.
So maybe just to pick up on Derek, I think in our line of business, we don't accept cultural arguments that somehow people are not ready for democracy. India's been a democracy since 1947, despite an inheritance with the world's biggest number of poor people, lack of educational opportunity, etc. In Sudan right now, in countries like Algeria right now, people are in the streets in places like Venezuela. Venezuela is a rich country. These other countries are not particularly. That's a different question, however, from then being able to translate people power into effective governance, right? And that's where an educated, civically minded populace makes all the difference. Otherwise, you have a tiny layer of elites at the top who may have benefited from foreign and other educational opportunities controlling politics to popular discontent.
Yeah. We take September 17th pretty seriously at SUNY. So September 17th is Constitution Day. And so some of the things we do range from panels with regard to understanding what are judicial appointments, what is executive privilege, rolling through a get out the vote. And it made a big difference in this last vote. There are actually some Senate seats that flipped because of the voter registration drive that the students ran. So I think that's some other ways that we can practice democracy in the academy.
talk a little bit about, you just referenced India, and I'm sure all been following the Indian election this week, and I've been struck by the number of stories that have focused on the power of women in this particular election. And I'm curious what you've seen around the world in your work about the importance of educating women and girls, and then whether or not that translates into bigger participation in the voting population in elections.
It's disproportionately impactful because women often run households, even if they do not have access to the same levels of employment as men. Women raise their children. We find it pays disproportionate dividends to invest in women all over the world. All over the world, there are male-dominated systems that are partly designed to keep women down and out. I observed the first elections in Afghanistan in 30 years in 2004. IRI and NDI were both there, and there were separate polling places for men and women in this very conservative, culturally conservative society. So my female election observation colleagues who went into these women's voting places found women tearing off their burqas and crying at the mere prospect of actually having a voice and a vote to shape that country's future. And this was a system that was designed to keep them down. The Taliban still want to do that, incidentally.
Please.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, just by definition, if you hold half of the people back in a democracy, it's not a democracy. And you're losing the perspectives, and women have, come at it, as Dan says, differently than men do. You don't get the diverse perspectives you need for democratic change. 30 years ago or 35 years ago, when they trace measures of exclusion of different populations in a society, the most excluded population 35 years ago were women around the world. It's reversed. Now they're the least excluded population. So it's growing, and there's a correlation between that and the evolution of democracy in the past 35 years in many countries. What's switched, though, the other way is the rural poor, that they were the most integrated and included, and now they're the most excluded. And you're seeing that now have an effect on democracy. So they absolutely have a connection. Empowering women, whether it's not just in elections, but just in engagement in society and all the different components of democracy is essential for its success.
And of course, it's linked to education again. I think I read somewhere recently, 18 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, that women who had at least a primary school education were 1.5 times more likely to participate or to want to participate and learn about democracy. So there is that link. If I could just pick up on something that you said in terms of excluding individuals and bringing it back to the US for a minute. So I'm sure many of you have read the Chetty study with regard to social mobility. And I think it's so perfect that this conversation is here at a great public institution. Because you look at we talked about the why of education and connection to democracy, equal opportunity. Who is getting access to that? So it turns out, I was surprised to learn this, but one SUNY campuses, or 64 campuses in the SUNY system, one single campus serves more lower income individuals than the entire Ivy League, all 8 universities combined. Mm-hmm. One other campus, which happens to be Stony Brook, is #1 in the AAU institution for moving individuals from the lower mobility quintile, lowest 20%, to the upper 20%. So this is the importance of public education, because it is the path forward in public higher education, and I couldn't agree more with you in terms of excellence.
Yeah, and as Dan said, women are running the households. They're passing along these values to kids. So if they're educated in civics and in democratic process, they pass that along. Yeah. And so it's just an effect, a ripple effect. It's all good.
And it strikes me that some of those kinds of lessons are outside of traditional schools, right? So clearly we're educating lots of people in traditional school environments. That translates, we believe, into higher voter participation and participation in democracy writ large. But let's talk a little bit about other kinds of institutions. And I know you've written some about practicing democracy in the context of other institutions. And we live in a time where, at least domestically, people have less confidence in institutions. So how do we grapple with finding other mechanisms for that sort of broader education around democratic principles and democratic practice when people have less confidence in the kinds of clubs and organizations and religious institutions they used to embrace more readily?
This is a really complicated problem. You can look at voter turnout rates in the United States in 2016 or 2018, and each successive age bracket, as you go down in age, shows lower rates of turnout and participation. But that's not all. They also, each successive age bracket will show lower rates of civic participation of other kinds, showing up at meetings, belonging to groups, organizations. Voting, which is what we're talking about so far, it's the ante of democracy, right? It's the minimum threshold. But if all you're doing is voting, and to our shame in the United States, we have relatively low rates of turnout and also a real problem with voter suppression. That's just the ante, and you need to think about it beyond that. What we know is that democracy is a habit. If you are participating in democratic institutions, if you are in your own life, meeting as part of a committee, you're likely to be not only more confident in institutions, but to have a much greater commitment to the other half of what we talk about when we talk about democracy, isn't just, did everyone go and cast a vote? But are there rules? Are there procedures? Did everybody agree to a certain rule-bound process for adjudicating outcomes? And are they committed to that process? And this is the hardest part of democracy, even when they lose. That's the hardest thing, to walk into a room, whether it's for a community meeting or an organization that you belong to, or to walk into a polling place, to cast your vote, to lose, and still be committed to the system. And that's a really unnatural thing to do. It's not something that I think anyone is naturally inclined to do, to lose an argument and say, oh, well, that's just great, let's go with, if your president won, that's good. It's the kind of thing that builds up over time through practice. And you can see across different nations and within the US that rates of participation in those kinds of groups correlate generally with faith in democracy, with voter participation, and with a commitment to abide by adverse outcomes. And that's something that's fraying severely in this country after 2 centuries in which we were an international outlier. We did this more than really any other democracy on the face of the earth. It's not even true anymore. We're regressing back to the mean, and I think you see the civic fabric fraying as a result.
Dan and Derek, are you seeing things globally around this issue as you think about sort of civic engagement and democracy building organizations? Curious what your perspective is from the global stage.
It's very similar to the US. On the one hand, I think confidence in institutions is down, in part because there's not space for young people, for instance, or others, to get into political parties. There's a lot of frustration about political party. But the good news is that political participation is up. Strangely, democracy is receding. We hear about the democratic recession. But participation is up. People are coming to the streets. People want to get engaged. The challenge is channeling that. How do you channel that when people are not confident in political parties nowadays, or that democracy will be responsive to them, or that there's a place for them in the political process when it's being controlled by elites, typically older male elites, in a lot of places in Africa or in the Middle East or elsewhere. So that's where the frustration is. And then you have the online issue of folks getting information. I'm sure we'll get to that, technology. People are more engaged online, for better or for worse. How do you channel that kind of energy in a way that's organized, that can be applied to the political process? We're challenged with this, actually, as organizations as well.
So Americans should realize that there are dislocations going on to our democracy that are actually affecting democracies globally. One is disinfo, misinfo, fake news. Just the social media landscape is putting extraordinary pressures on democratic practice around the world, not just in the United States. Related to that, it's creating avenues for hostile authoritarian powers who want to weaken our democracy, not just the United States, but those of our friends and allies. It creates new vectors into our societies for them. And they don't need this or that candidate to win. They just need people to be polarized and angry and divisive. Right? That's not just affecting us, it's affecting Europe, it's affecting Taiwan, it's affecting everyone. 3, there is a disenchantment, as Derek said, because institutions don't look like they are working as well. Strong leaders take power and use the executive authority to hollow out countervailing institutions of government, parliaments, congresses, judges, free media. That's a global phenomenon. The strongman effect is not just something you see in Turkey or in the Philippines, it's happening more widely. And finally, kind of youth participation. Lots of young people, more activated, more motivated than ever, but not sure that their voice is really heard in the voting booth. And then the question is, well, how else do you mobilize to affect political outcomes? And the answer, of course, as Yoni said, is that there are all sorts of ways to mobilize politically beyond actually voting on voting day.
But democracy is a means to an end, right? And the end is that it has to deliver for people. People have to feel like this process is giving them opportunity, economic opportunities, keeping them secure, et cetera. That's where I think people are getting frustrated. In part, 20 years ago when there was a big democratic wave after the Cold War, I think expectations were just very, very high, maybe too high, that this was going to be easy, that we'll just take on the processes and the institutions of democracy, of elections and political parties and parliaments, and that naturally just give it time and it'll be fine. It'll plant the seeds, water them, and it'll sprout. Now we're seeing it's not that easy. And when people feel that their expectations aren't met, they'll blame the system. And then you have folks come in and say, only I can fix this. I give you an easy answer to a really tough situation. And that siren song is very attractive. And folks will then try that because this democracy thing is messy. It's hard. It takes responsibility. It takes education. While the strong man, well, they'll just deliver. I don't have to worry about it. And, but that too obviously doesn't deliver in the end. And where do you go after that? And that's the challenge. We have to demonstrate that democracy delivers and that democracy works.
So I was struck this morning as I was listening to the panel talking about how covering the White House has changed so dramatically over the last number of decades. We've moved from the once-a-day briefing to the blogosphere to the sort of 24/7 news cycle. And I think more globally, we just live in a time where there's this notion of immediate gratification and people wanting something and wanting it then. And we need to make the case collectively for investment in the kinds of institutions that we know take a really long time to foster change. So democracy-building institutions, schools, starting with early childhood, these things take a generation to sort of work through the system. And I'm curious, from a kind of small p political perspective, how do we make the case for that kind of investment when people do want change now?
I'm going to take the low-hanging fruit here, and you guys can do the hard work. One thing that works for some audiences, not everyone, but some, is really, I think, to make the case that we're in a much more competitive global environment than we have been in, right? We won World War II. The major economies outside the United States were flattened. We had all of this prosperity in the decades that followed. We won the Cold War. Our dominant great power competitor collapsed, right? Europe became whole and free. Democracy spread in all regions. The world is really different today. There are 1.4 billion Chinese, most of whom are online, many of whom are highly educated, a growing middle class, the world's biggest middle class now in China emerging. India is coming online in a way that is connecting Indians to the world in a way that they have not been connected since India became independent. Really, the rise of all regions. Africa is going to have 4 billion people by 2100. Many of them, unfortunately, will not be highly educated, just given the governance and other challenges in sub-Saharan Africa. But sort of the world that America made, parts of it are gone. And some of it is good, which is what we want successful, thriving democracies to come up all over the place. We want to live in a middle-class world, which has never happened before in human history. But on the other hand, there's a lot of competition there. And so the old ways of doing business in this country, including in the education system, including with infrastructure, including with technology, we need to do a little better because other countries are hustling.
Well, if I could follow up on that, which I agree with what you're saying. I think that, though, our existential threat is even one step up, if I could. All right, I'll admit it, I'm a Game of Thrones fan. And if you watched it, our winter is coming. Unfortunately, it's not a winter. It's going to be a very hot summer. And that's going to take cooperation among countries and around the world. So I get what you're saying is that traditionally, I think that we've responded to threats more competitively. Now I think the question is, how do we use democracy and education to get the kind of cooperation that we will need in order to survive as not only the human species, but there's 1 million species the United Nations just said is going to become extinct. So how we can figure out how to use democracy to the greater good and education, I think is that meta question.
No one turns off a freshly paved highway and picks up their cell phone and calls their congressman to ask him to start setting aside money for 20 years from now, or they're going to have to pave it again. But if you hit a bunch of potholes on that road, you may make that call. Well, that's where we are. We're hitting potholes. We're newly cognizant of the fact that our democracy is not, in fact, self-sustaining and auto-correcting, that it takes a continual reinvestment in its infrastructure in order to keep it functioning smoothly. And so that is, if there is a silver lining to the political upheaval in this country over the last several years, I think that's it. I think that people now understand that you can't simply tune out and assume that America's basic institutions will function and somebody else will deal with their problems. And so I do think that there is momentum behind the kinds of long-term investments in educational infrastructure, in civic participation, in voting rights. I can see that each of these things is newly energized over the last several years, and not solely on a partisan basis, that people on both sides of the aisle are able to see that American democracy has hit some potholes, and that we're going to have to actually invest in restoring the infrastructure that we all used to enjoy and take for granted.
Yeah. The biggest danger, I think, in life and in democracy is complacency. I mean, you figure, oh, it's going to work out, it's fine, I don't need to be involved, something will be taken care of. And, the cliche we always say is democracy is not a spectator sport. You have to get involved if you're going to defend it. And it's basically about accountability. I mean, if you break down democracy into its component parts, it's about transparency, accountability. So do people want to hold their leaders accountable? Do they want to have say in their affairs? Do they want to know what's going on in their communities? And do they want to make sure that whoever governs them is doing the right thing? There's no corruption or abuse of power. I think people want that, but will it deliver on jobs and security? They'll be less patient if not. And that's what we're seeing in our own country. When people start to feel insecure, not just from outside power, but their own job security and other things, they'll go for an alternative. They'll say, the heck with the elites who are self-dealing, we'll go for something different. We want change. We don't care what the change is, we'll just take change. And we see that overseas, it's the same here.
I think it's interesting if you look at the candidates that have come forward on the Democratic side, looking at 2020, many of them talking about free tuition, free college. So we've been working on that in the state of New York through what's called the Excelsior. So any student that comes from a family that makes less than $125,000 a year will have free tuition. So I think you are seeing that we do need to have those kind of investments, and we need to have them nationally. When you think of the 11.6 jobs that were created in 6 years post the Great Recession, 11.5 or 99% went to somebody who had some kind of college. And 60% of the jobs that disappeared were jobs that were held by people with only a high school education. So I think there is a crisis here, where the frog's in the boiling water, but we have to wake up and kind of smell the roses there, that we need more investment. And it's also more expensive because the reason I would say that we've enjoyed the quality of life we've had post-World War II is because of the investment in science, technology, fueling the next generation of innovation.
So the College Promise strategy is one strategy, and I'm curious, I want to make sure that before we get to questions, we end on some optimistic notes. So a couple questions, which will, because I'm sure many of us are sitting here thinking, yeah, but. And so wondering if knowing that you can't mandate democracy, what are the 2 or 3 things, whether they're sort of legislatively or otherwise, that you would like to see in place, or barriers you'd like to see removed if you could wave a wand, that you think would have the biggest impact in terms of flipping a switch to give people either an opportunity to practice? We certainly have enough drama, I think, that people will feel, to your point, encouraged to participate, and we've seen that over the last number of elections, particularly among, I think in the last election, every population, in fact, voted at a higher level. But what 2 or 3 barriers would you want to see removed, or what 2 or 3 requirements would you like to see in place that you think would foster, and let's talk domestically here just because it's a bit easier, that you think would help support the kind of change we need to inspire greater democratic participation?
We do international, so.
We can ask globally too, We'll get to that.
I think you started out with it. We have to provide access to quality higher education for every individual. And I think going back to your story on whipping the ball, I'm fixated on it. is that we have to give individuals the applied learning opportunities. So if we look at what the higher education bill, which is up for reauthorization, what we'd really like to see is the federal work-study program be expanded. We'd like to see Pell Grants for students that are in certificate programs, things where we do just-in-time learning. So we've talked about these two institutions that are old and haven't evolved as fast as maybe some of the other institutions have that are really important, democracy and education, but we need to be able to apply some of the tools that we see in other industries, like just-in-time learning, like an education cloud, like being able to use an AI assistant, because we know from work that when you augment human intelligence with machine intelligence and vice versa, you get about 99% accuracy in the tasks that you're doing. So I think that it's recognizing those changes that we need, and we need to invest in it.
200 years ago, this university was founded by a group of privileged white men for the education of other privileged white men. We enfranchised African Americans 50 years after that. We're on the centenary of enfranchising the other half of the population and giving women the right to vote. None of those things got us to equality, right? They moved the needle. They brought the country forward. But we don't have racial justice in this country. We don't have full gender parity in the workforce or in other aspects of our society. We need to continue, I think, striving for that. But a key component of that is to empower people, particularly those from historically disadvantaged backgrounds, with all the tools of democratic participation. It's the case, for example, that if you're in high school, if you're at a largely white or largely affluent school, you're much more likely to have a student government, an actual student government, than if you're in a poor or majority minority school. We don't give the same tools of participation. Just like experiential learning is essential for entering the workforce, experiential learning is essential for entering a democracy. And that's, I think, scary to a lot of administrators. I think it's scary for a lot of very well-intentioned people who run programs in such communities, because it means ceding control. It means adults letting go and giving kids who they're educating a chance. It means people with power ceding a degree of power to the ordinary members of their communities. But absent that, absent a real effort to push power back out and to give people a chance to participate, I don't know how ordinary Americans develop the habits that they'll need to actually seize power as adults or as full participants in a community.
Can I pick up on that for a minute? Because you wanted something optimistic, right? Okay, so I think one of the things that I recognize too, what I think you're saying is that we need to empower those that have not been included before. So now I'm going to tell a story. That was a good idea. So when I was in college, I went to an elite private university, and it's a great place, Stanford. Undergraduate and graduate, I was there 8 years. I had 2 women professors, none in my field. I was an electrical engineer and still am. I had one in communications and one professor who was a woman in psychology. Worst grades I got, that's another story. So, psychology of sex roles, I didn't believe the material I was reading at the time, but that was 40 years ago, but enough of that. The point was when I graduated, I didn't think I could become a professor because I didn't have any women professors in the technical fields. So recognizing that, when you look at the SUNY system, largest comprehensive system in the US, 25% of our students are underrepresented minorities. Only 7% of our faculty are underrepresented minorities. So we've launched the Prodigy, which is promoting recruitment and retention of individuals with inclusion and diversity to change that. 1,000 new professors over the next decade, underrepresented minorities. We can do 100 a year. We've got 60 on tap for this fall. So I think that, again, it comes back to investment, and investment in a very specific way so that we make sure that, as Marion Wright Edelman said, if you see it, you can be it.
Derek and Dan, globally, is it about universal access to education? Is it about other kinds of institutions? If you could wave a wand, what's the one barrier you would remove or the one investment you would make?
A big one for me is inclusion of women and other disadvantaged minorities. I mean, democracy is not just the rule of the majority, the tyranny of the majority. You have to involve minority populations and ensuring that there are equal rights, equity for all. So you have in diverse societies, diverse perspectives that are respected. You can't have democracy without that. And as we said earlier, I mean, women and youth, given the demographics of Africa, as Dan said, and the Middle East and of elsewhere in Southeast Asia, if you don't open the system up, if you don't break the tyranny of the older men, not all white there, but older men in these countries, you're not going to regenerate. You're not going to get the energy. You're not going to get the new ideas with the new technologies and release all this great energy that can be educated. Education is obviously important, but they're educating themselves in these things, and we're helping through the programs that we do. But that's sort of an undervalued asset. It's ready to be brought out. The question is how to channel it appropriately. And without channeling it correctly, which is the challenge, I think it can be as much a challenge as an opportunity.
So I agree with Derek, and particularly young people in politics, getting a new generation in positions of authority, because we know a set of 30-something congressmen and women, and they look at the world very differently than some of their wiser, more experienced peers. And that links to technology. This is really about the world, not just the United States, but includes the United States. Technology is changing the nature of our relationship with each other, with the economy, with government, with the world. And I mean, my plea to young people is don't believe everything you read online. We're constantly having this conversation at my house with my children. But more broadly, we need to figure out how to make technology work for democracy. The things in our pockets should be the most extraordinary tool for participatory, responsive, transparent politics since like the printing press. Yeah. Somehow they have turned into vehicles for mass surveillance and polarization and disfigurization of open societies. And I'm actually more optimistic about the next phase. I actually think that was the last phase. We're opening our eyes and getting smarter, including how foreign authoritarian actors use these technologies. But these things should work for democracy and for people.
Yeah, absolutely.
No question. And go ahead.
And just to add really quickly on this, I mean, we talk about education, schools. We're in a university, so that kind of education. Really what people need is information. Yeah. For democracy. Many uneducated people, if they can't get an education, they're still equal citizens that deserve the right and the practice of democracy. But the online stuff, and the other methods of getting disinformation out there, of dividing, of creating hate, this is extremely pernicious. This is probably the biggest threat I see to democracy globally. When I came into NDI 9 months ago, and this is the issue. And it's not just what we're facing today, it's evolving. We're gonna have deepfake, where you don't know, when you look at something online and YouTube, it's completely generated out of nothing. So you don't know it's real or not. So if people don't have good information, they don't even know if the information they see is real, then how are you gonna make judgments and how are you gonna have a democracy? And that's what the autocrats want. They want to confuse. That's what the Russians are doing, trying to confuse, they're trying to disrupt, they're trying to divide. And it's much easier to do that than to bring people together. And this is our big challenge.
Did you want to jump in, Chris?
No, I just wanted to ask a question. I mean, we have the technology right now to differentiate between fake news and non-fake news, right? But we're not using it. It's and so my question is, why, if we had something that was on each of our cell phones that could look at a piece of news and just say, yeah, that's BS. One, would we use it? Two, do people understand what original source scholarship means? And three, would it make a difference?
I'm not sure we can do that. I mean, the level of information on the internet from all kinds of sources, from so-called media sources or suspect sources that are generated by the Internet Research Agency in Russia. I mean, this is what Facebook and the rest of them are dealing with. They're trying to bail water when there's a tidal wave of information coming in.
So I think they've been reactive and not proactive, but I
completely agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a fascinating talk by Terry Sinofsky, who's wrote the book Deep Learning, if you know it. I've known him 30 years, he's fantastic. He showed me something really creepy, and I think it could either be good or not. What he showed is that someone took pictures of celebrities, extracted the features of what we think a celebrity looks like, then gave another picture of all the thumbnail sketches of celebrities. They don't exist. There are people that look real, but they don't exist. It's going to now be videos. So you get back to, it doesn't exist. It is being totally made up, but I still think that in that signature, you can differentiate whether there is a real source of that or not.
Jump in here as a credentialed member of the fake news media and as a historian. The printing press did not give us peace and tranquility in Europe. It gave us 100 years of sectarian religious violence. New media technologies are tremendously destabilizing. They have a potential enormous upside, but also invariably have produced discord. There's a case to be made that the coming of the Civil War was accelerated by the invention of telegraphic news, which allowed congressmen to be much more tightly tied to the passions of their districts. So whenever we've faced one of these secular changes in information technology, we've gone through a period of democratic upheaval. What typically restores that balance is the presence of mediating institutions. So to the extent that what you have is an amorphous glob of information and an amorphous mass of users, it's really, really hard to deal with that in a way that's going to be consistent with a society committed to the rule of law, committed to stabilizing institutions, not just the expression of a tyranny of the majority, but something deeper than that in terms of democracy. And that, I think, is what we're actually watching hollow out. We're watching all of the local papers in America sequentially fail. We're watching the erosion of many of the participatory institutions where people would talk to each other about these things. And if you had a relationship of trust with somebody on the other side of the aisle, it was much, much harder to sow that kind of discord and fear. And those relationships are attenuating. We know that we're separating out into more polarized communities. So when I think about this, I think about it not actually as a problem of the news media or of information technology, but fundamentally, even if those are the causes, I think the cures are going to be social. The cures are going to be about knitting together stronger institutions and communities, more diverse communities, communities where people can talk to each other and establish bonds and relationships of trust so that they can sort of build up the immune system against the contagion of misinformation.
Yeah, I mean, I think digital, I felt, I was ambassador in Burma, Myanmar. I mean, I really did feel seeing it happen there in real time. I mean, digital was killing democracy in a way because of this. And the only way you can really have democracy is something like this. We're not obviously talking to, we were talking at you sort of, but you do need to have, a conversation with people. You have to get people together and talk face to face. If you're doing it through a screen, particularly if you're sitting in a room by yourself, there's nothing about society that's shaping you. You're just letting the worst out of you because it's, you can be anything you want to be. It's easy. So you have to, that's why communities matter. And so there has to be something, we're not getting rid of the technology. You can't reverse technology. It's here to stay. You want to harness it, but then you have to find some ways to create bonds between people face to face somehow. Otherwise, I think we are in some trouble.
Dan, not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot, you indicated that you think we've sort of been in this period where technology has been truly a double-edged sword, but that you're optimistic that we may be able to move beyond that. Is that for similar kinds of reasons that we've just heard, or for different ones?
I mean, I think it's because we have been so, these technology tools stimulate us actually in unhealthy ways. And I think as we open our eyes to this, we realize that actually sometimes unplugging is good, sometimes a face-to-face conversation is good, sometimes a text-to-email exchange is resolved very simply by picking up the phone. I don't mean to sound too antiquated, but I actually suspect there may be a reversion to like less technology interface over time for many of us who have become focused on living in this virtual world. And the answer, I think, this blend of AI and human intelligence, I think the answer is it's going to be a mix. But I'm hoping it will be a different mix 10, 20, 30 years from now than it is now because the balance is not right.
So that is relatively optimistic. We have 2 more minutes before we turn to our questions. Any other cause for optimism in what is clearly a sort of tumultuous period of time globally?
No, there are democracies that are developing out there. There are countries that are moving in the right direction on democracy, and as I say, political participation is up. The desire for democracy remains, and a lot of what we've been working on before I arrived, but 35 years around the world, the foundations are still there. The expectations of having a voice are there, and people are fighting back, even in places where there's regression. So, including here, or in Poland, or even in Hungary. So. I'm optimistic in that sense, but I'm not a Pollyanna to suggest that the challenges are not great or not growing.
I would just add that, there's a lot of doom and gloom in the democracies, but in fact, if you look at Russia, China, Iran, the things their unelected leaders fear most are their own people. And so we think that these strongmen, these uber strongmen running great powers, regional challengers, we think of them as being indomitable and invulnerable, and in fact, they're highly insecure and anxious because they know they do not have the legitimacy that comes through popular participation, popular vote, accountability, checks and balances. And so we in the democracies, all of our flaws and faults are out there for everybody to read, for the Atlantic to report on, etc. That's just not true in a closed society, and we should just be mindful of that.
think the thing that makes me optimistic, last night I was at the Farmingdale State College commencement, one of our schools, and just seeing 1,000 kids walk across the stage, so happy, so excited about what the future is, having accomplished something they set out to do. 250 of those students were from families where they're first to go to college. So just seeing the joy and the excitement that they have, we owe it to them to make sure we sustain our democracy.
Russia doesn't have an immigration crisis. There is still something to the American idea, to the principles articulated by a bunch of very flawed individuals a couple hundred years ago. But they gave us the right principles, even if they didn't always live them out themselves. And those principles have been something of a lodestar, and we've measured ourselves against that standard, and it's aspirational. It's not a standard we've ever come close to achieving, but it still is a standard that is inspirational and that draws people from around the world. And as long as we remain open to that, to gathering people in this country, as long as we hold ourselves internally by those standards, I'm tremendously optimistic.
Great, thank you. We've been getting questions from folks who are watching and maybe some folks here as well, and two wonderful UVA students have been curating them and are going to ask questions on behalf of the audience.
Thank you so much to the panel. We have some audience questions for you. So the first one is, you mentioned the importance of young people participating actively in democracy, but a lot of young people have said that they feel alienated by America's political party system. Do you think that alternative approaches to voting, such as ranked choice voting, would help democracy by encouraging greater participation, or are there other ways that we can use our educational system to incentivize this?
I mean, one thing is actually just, there's a big difference between voting in a national election for, say, a president, and voting for your mayor, your city council, your police chief, or however your region is organized. It's much easier for citizens to connect with governments at a local level. We see this all over the world in our work, that there are disproportionate dividends to investing in local governance and that connectivity that you get at the municipal level. And so, I mean, that's part of the answer, I think, is that it doesn't need to be about who is the President of the United States. It can very much be about who is looking after your town.
That's true, but we've narrowed substantially the participation gap among young voters and older voters at the presidential level. It's still there, but there's been an enormous surge in youth turnout the last couple cycles. The numbers on this are much sketchier, but most of the academic research will peg the average age of a municipal voter somewhere between 55 and 65, overwhelmingly white, even in majority minority cities. And so at the local level where young voters can have the greatest impact, they're doing the least. And so, whereas they're much more engaged with national and with global issues than I think they were when I was their age. And so I think that this is a real problem and a challenge, but at the same time, that there's potential there. That the most dangerous and volatile situation is where you get people showing up and voting in a system where they have no confidence. That is where democracy can get itself in real trouble, because the vote can become an expression of anger and frustration and despair. The best situation is where they're engaging at the local level, at the state level, and then up at the national level, and using that participation in order to exercise their power to drive public policy in ways that they think will benefit themselves and their communities.
I think that's where universities can take a leadership role, is to have students, encourage students, graduate and run for something.
We mentioned ranked choice voting, by the way, which is an interesting test that's being tried, I think, in Maine and some other places around the country. I think it's a great idea to test to see whether that works for our system. But we change our electoral system very, very rarely. But it's worth doing. I mean, states are the testing grounds for these things. I think we should continue to test.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. Our question from the audience is as follows. Some panelists have alluded to decreased confidence in global institutions and perhaps America's declining hegemony in the world. How can we continue to spread democracy through education in light of this fact, and is it still desirable to do so?
It's a question we get a lot, is how can you go out and talk about democracy when American democracy is in recession or in trouble? First of all, I do agree that the American model, the American face right now is not is not what we want it to be when it comes to this, and it matters. It matters a lot to our work. On the other hand, folks overseas who are struggling with democracy are not saying, well, America can't do it, therefore we don't want our rights. We don't want to have new voting or new institutions or processes. There's still folks out there who are energized, who want to participate. And what we do, frankly, is not export the American model. That's not what we do. We don't go around and say you should be like the United States. We're based in Washington, but what we have, and we've developed in 35 years, is a network of small d Democrats from around the world who are practitioners, who have developed it themselves in their environments. And we share those experiences with other like countries with similar cultures or backgrounds, so they can learn from each other, build a network, and build their own sort of rights and institutions. So it's not about, look at us, we're America, we're all perfect. But clearly it's a headwind that the face of America is what it is today.
There's a contrarian's case to be made that the global surge of populism is in fact a surge of support for democracy, that many of our post-war institutions were functionally about delegating decisions once made by sovereign nations to a bunch of unelected experts. It's a complicated case because those institutions were ultimately accountable to democratic polities in many ways, and in other ways were not. And so I think you can also make the case that the revolt against these global institutions, the deep skepticism, even the surge of nationalism and populism is the flip side of that coin, is a faith in decision-making that is vested in the sovereign people, and doubling down on the democratic method after an extended period in which we had moved in a different direction.
I mean, it's a natural desire to have rights. It's a natural desire to have a say in your own affairs. Yeah. So, yes, the American model is not great, but I think there's a lot out there to be hopeful about, and people are still fighting for these things.
Many American students today profess that student debt limits the opportunities and lifestyles that they can pursue following their education. What, if any, effect do you believe that the student debt crisis has on political participation today?
I might comment on student debt. I'm not an expert on how maybe it influences the democratic, participation. But I think that some of the numbers that you see on student debt are pretty phenomenal. And they're very different than when I was in school. So we have 1.4 million students. About half of them go to school tuition free. But that's only 25% of the cost of going to a residential campus. So I think that for public institutions, and I know UVA has been out in front on this for a long time and is someone that we look to, is we have to get the private citizen to invest in public institutions as well. Too easy, it's too often I hear, well, I already pay taxes, tax support. And I think that's where we have to look back and endow the next generation. I think it's unconscionable to have kids start out with an average, even from SUNY, which is low, but the national average is $25,000 in debt. And there's story after story where it can be much higher. We have to solve that. We have to make sure that they start off on an even playing field with the kind of education that will allow them to lead a productive and rewarding life.
Derek, if we believe that more educated citizens are more likely to engage, you talked a lot about lifestyle and people wanting jobs and wanting happy lives. And do you see student debt as a potential contributor to a new level of activism among college graduates?
I haven't focused on that. I can imagine it would be, but it's just a burden. It's a drain. So if you're focused on you have to get a job, you have to have two jobs sometimes because you have one job that doesn't pay enough for the mortgage plus your student debt. Then you're not thinking about being active. You don't have time to be a citizen even. It's a huge luxury in a way. So I don't blame folks for being worn down by all that.
At IRI, our retention rates have gone way up because we instituted a student debt write-down program where we would take on the burden of X proportion of debt after several years of service at IRI. And it's been a game changer for lots of our younger people. That obviously cannot be the solution. But I think some of us are trying to creatively think about what we can do about this structural problem.
I think your HR website is probably getting thousands of hits.
Earlier within this panel, the notion of citizenship as a job was mentioned. How can educational institutions effectively introduce students to this notion of citizenship as a job?
Can I take one shot at this just from having dinner with John Meacham last night and talking about American history, which is something that lots of people do in and around UVA? More historical learning and understanding of what this country has been through over the course of 200 plus years, and how previous generations of highly imperfect and flawed leaders have grappled with challenges, frankly, more profound than those we face today. And it helps not to talk about it maybe at a level of generality at a macro level, but is really to look at specific historical incidents, including some which involved people like Thomas Jefferson, but running all the way through our history, when great but flawed leaders overcame compelling challenges to self-government, to American security, to inclusion. We've been through a lot of this before. Actually, it's been bad before. For people who are pessimistic, read American history. It's not all pretty, right? But the country has come through, and we're a great country, and we're strong. And so I just think a little more self-awareness of where we are in the flow of American history would be quite fruitful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's up to us. Yeah.
Technology has become a core part of education in many American school systems, but as you mentioned, it can also be a force to spread disinformation and fake news. Given that not all schools, American and otherwise, have equal access to technology, how can people learn to protect themselves from the misuse of technologies and social media?
Well, first of all, I think going back to being committed to honesty in reporting. This was not that you at all. But no, it wasn't really. But what I'm thinking about is going back to what we talked about earlier in technology. We have the technology now to assess whether something is true or not. I mean, we do. I mean, in fact, the same programs that tell you if a paper has been plagiarized are the same, owned by sometimes the same company that puts papers out there on the internet. It's kind of crazy. But so we have both sides of the equation. I think that what Dan said earlier was that we also have an endpoint device that everybody can use to assess what they're hearing and reading, if it's accurate or true. We're just not using it in that way yet. But I think we will get there. I think that's probably the next wave that we're coming to.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Beyond responding to tragedies with protests, what realistic actions can young leaders below the voting age take today to be civically engaged and preserve and encourage democracy and political change?
People under voting age are still citizens. I mean, you can organize, and I mean, it's powerful. I mean, the Children's Crusade and the Civil Rights Movement was quite powerful. To demonstrate the moral authority of kids. This is affecting our lives. You're never too young or never too old to be involved and get engaged. But do they know how to be engaged? Do they know how to get involved? That's where the schools do come in. That's where the parents come in. That's where society comes in. I think that's where we're falling short.
So America has sometimes been described as a nation of joiners. And my advice is pretty simple. Join. What we've seen with a variety of social upheavals is that if you take to the streets, if you launch the digital petition, you can dominate the news cycle for 1 day or 2 days or 3. If you get together with people and you meet face-to-face on a regularized schedule, weekly, a couple times a month, and you assign tasks and share the responsibilities and elect officers, if you institutionalize it, and I know there's a tremendous resistance today to institutionalizing these things, but if you do institutionalize it, you don't need a vote. You're going to have an impact. You can create something that grows beyond your own direct efforts. It can spawn new chapters. You can create something which can survive your own adolescence. I mean, one of the problems with organizing young people is they keep getting older, and so they graduate into the ranks of voting citizens, which is fabulous, but then you're leaving the problem for the next 16-year-old. If you leave behind a set of institutions that they too can join and participate in and belong to. And when I see young people actually impacting politics again and again, that this is what they're doing. They belong to something which is face-to-face. They meet on a regular basis. They create an agenda. They set clear goals, and then they go out there in pursuit of them. And God help us all, because they will get it done when they do that. But that particular work of organizing, it's not something we particularly stress in our educational system at this point. It's not something to which Americans are habituated. And it is the greatest advantage that the old currently wield against the young in this country. That they participate at much higher rates. They get out there, they join things, they show up, they make their voices heard. Somebody asked about student debt and whether it could drive a higher turnout. I think that question is exactly backwards. I think if we had a higher turnout, if 18 to 29-year-olds voted and participated at the same rates as 55 to 65 years old, then the cost of higher education would be the same kind of untouchable third rail that Social Security presently is. So join.
Right.
Yeah, that's good.
So I agree. I have a slightly different answer, which is that the point of American constitutional government was not to create an all-powerful government that would solve everyone's problems. It was actually to preserve individual liberty and allow human freedom to flourish in its fullest sense. And I'm not sure that government is ever going to be the best vehicle for that. Political activism is one way to do that. It's not the only way. Obviously, we care a lot as democracy organization leaders. We care quite a lot about the organization of government, but it cannot simply be about, at the end of the day, what government can do. It has to be about what citizens can do with the liberty that democratic self-government has given them. And that's a bigger question than just political participation and elections, for sure.
So it's my hope today that this panel would be provocative, educational, and leave us with some level of optimism. And I think that on those three criteria, you all did not, in fact, whiff, but you hit a home run. So thank you. Please join me in thanking everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. We've been delighted to have with us students in the Global Pathfinder Summit. Those participants are going to be leaving after this session. We'll be bringing in another wave of guests. We're going to take about a 5-minute break. When you see a short Miller Center video starting, that will be your cue to get back in your seats. You've got about 90 seconds from when the video starts before the next panel.
all set? Welcome, everyone. I'm Joe Erdman, a trustee of the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation and a member of the Miller Center Governing Council. I'm pleased to introduce this panel which will examine an especially timely topic, the nexus of race and religion in American identity and democracy. These issues could not be more meaningful for us here in Charlottesville, given the events of August 11th and 12th, 2017. Going back to our founding as a nation, we have struggled with how to realize self-evident truths of our common and equal humanity. Our terrific panel today will lead us in a focused discussion on the path forward for our nation during a divided and divisive time. Ibram Kendi is the founding director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. A thoughtful cultural historian and winner of the National Book Award, has challenged deeply held assumptions about political identity, turning our understanding of the term racism upside down. Jason Johnson, all the way to the right, professor in the School of Global Journalism and Communication at Morgan State University and a UVA grad, is proud Wahoo. Is known for his ability to inform with wit and candor and for his fresh and objective voice in political and social commentary. He's also a political analyst on MSNBC. Rabbi David Saperstein, Director Emeritus of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism and former U.S. Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom, has been one of the world's leading advocates for religious liberty and tolerance. He has explored the shift in voting patterns in America over the years, acknowledging that while these trends were once determined by ethnicity and race, today's voting is largely influenced by religion and faith. Finally, Larisha Hawkins, who holds joint appointments in politics and religious studies at UVA, has studied and built connections between political, racial, and religious groups. She finds an incontestable link between racial and religious dynamics and observes through her research the influence of religious motives in setting party agendas. Finally, this conversation is going to be moderated by our own Sid Milkus, the White Burkett Miller Professor at the Miller Center, and the Cavaliers Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Department of Politics here at UVA. In addition to being America's leading political scientist on the American presidency, Sid is a recent... I get paid on the side for these things. He is a recent co-author of Rivalry and Reform, which traces the history of social movements alongside presidential administrations. Sid, it's all yours. Enjoy it. I hope we learned something positive.
Good afternoon. How are you all? You doing well? It's really weird I can't see you, so I want to hear you. So I want to thank Bill Anthalis and Stephanie Abbott for giving me the honor of moderating this distinguished panel on an extremely important topic, race, religion, and national identity. I've done a lot of teaching and research in Europe, and the fault line in Europe tends to be class. But in the United States, if you study the history, although class is not unimportant, the most inspiring and disruptive fault lines in American politics are race and religion. And although national identity has deep historical roots, there were fervent debates about slavery at the Constitutional Convention. It has become particularly important at certain times in our history, and this is one of our times. This is one of those times. So as one of my favorite moderators on CNN says, Don Lemon says, let's discuss. So in the spirit of PrezFest, I want to begin with the presidency, but not Donald Trump. I want to begin with President Obama. We've just passed the 10th anniversary of the election of our first African-American president, and I want to ask each of our panelists to at least begin with some brief remarks about Obama's presidency and how it has affected this kind of halting march towards a more perfect union. And Ibrahim, I want to begin with you because you've written this monumental history of the battle between racism and anti-racism. And I wonder if you just tell us where you think Barack Obama fits in this enduring struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness.
Wow.
And then we'll be done and we can all go out for a glass of wine.
Sure. I think that we should, I try to push back against the popular narrative of steady and forward racial progress, and that Obama is a representation of racial progress. The way in which I seek to push back against that idea is to say that we've also, as a nation, been experiencing, in addition to a march of racial progress, a march of racist progress. And so I think what was critical about the Obama era when he was in the White House was we as Americans and people, whether it was people who were suffering the effects of racism, wanting it to be over, or whether the people who were guilty about the persistence of racism, we all sort of wanted it to be over or behind us, or that we're almost sort of there. And so we were overlooking during that era the forces of racist progress that were strengthening and growing and ultimately blasted onto our front lawns and even into cities like Charlottesville years later.
Do you think Americans tend to put too much emphasis on the presidency? Was too much faith invested in Obama because he was elected to the presidency and somehow that was going to have marvelous consequences for racial progress?
I think there is also, I think what's actually happening is Americans put faith in a Messiah, in some sort of racial Messiah, whether they're positioning Martin Luther King, whether they're positioning Rosa Parks, whether they're positioning Harriet Tubman. We like to position these individuals, these grand historical subjects, as the people, through the force of their will and righteousness, was able to move the country forward. And that's just not how history has actually happened. And so clearly, when you have a pivotal historical figure step into the most powerful office in the country, you have both notions of the power of the presidency colliding with notions of this racial messiah, which I think both anointed Obama as if he was going to save us and save the world from racism.
Yeah. David, you were sort of in the middle of this collision. You were part of the Obama White House. I wonder what your thoughts are on his presidency. What was your experience there?
The fact that an African American could be elected was an extraordinarily energizing impact for people who care about eliminating racism in America. The fact that he, to some extent, in part perhaps because he felt constraints being the first African-American president. I mean, let's remember the manifestation, the visible manifestation of ongoing police violence against particularly youth of color in this country. The rising of Black Lives Matter, here to say enough of these patterns and they have to be shattered. All of that happened and there were limits to what he was able to do. So I feel exactly the tension that you're talking about, but I will say this. When he went to Iowa, I just came from speaking to a statewide conference in Iowa 4 days ago. When he was in Iowa, his ability to excite young people in Iowa, which is a state with a very small percentage of people of color. And it was, to me, an extraordinarily encouraging thing when you see the voting patterns of younger people, whatever race they were, whatever religion they were, voting for Barack Obama in much higher proportion than their elders were. It is a very kind of exciting idea here. But what he showed, vividly in his successes and limitations was we're not in a post-racial society that many people, when the election happened, were talking about here. And now we have to come to grips with that in very serious and direct ways.
Larissa, as I recall, you were teaching at a small liberal arts college in the Midwest during at least part of President Obama's 2 terms. And what was the feel in that college out there during his presidency?
And that very small college is a predominantly white evangelical college called Wheaton College. And it's often called the Harvard of Christian colleges. So I say that to say astute colleagues there, like I have astute colleagues here, brilliant students there, just as I have brilliant students here. And at the time I lived in Hyde Park, I actually jogged to Obama's polling place that morning. Got some video. I think the Secret Service were freaked out by the woman with the video standing on the fence, But it was a moment where I had to think about the personal and the professional. And personally, how I felt as a woman whose grandmother went to the March on Washington with my great aunt and didn't take my 13-year-old father, who said he cried like a baby, and he never cried because she said we didn't know whether we would make it back. And so to see Obama elected, partisan politics notwithstanding, was personally amazing. And to be on the train out to the suburbs the next day and to see the sour faces of the white suburban folks. That's what it's like to live in the Midwest, in liberal Chicago, and you just go downstate or west state a little bit. And the zeitgeist was totally different, right? But that was that moment. But I will also add, as a political scientist, to the previous question, I find it odd, as someone who studies race, religion, its intersection in policy in American institutions and culturally, that I am never asked previously about race relations during Bush's administration or during Clinton's administration. That race and the presidency always collide and coalesce. Yet, so few people in the upper echelons of the academy are asking about what were the racial consequences of the presidency of a white man. And I think it's important to shift our questioning, like how did Nixon's benign neglect affect race relations in the US, right? But back to Obama, I think it's important to note not just that we've realized there's no such thing as a post-racial America, that a Black body in the White House also collided with Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice and Rakia Boyd and Sandra Bland and Philando Castile and Laquan McDonald from Chicago's side of the city, or from Obama's side of Chicago, right? While Mayor Rahm Emanuel was at the helm. So I think those questions about race in the presidency are important, and it's important to note that they need to reverberate when a white man occupies the White House.
Nixon was the first one to style himself as the leader of the silent majority in America. Jason?
So I'll begin with this. I was in a small liberal arts college full of mostly white kids too. I was in a small school called Hiram College, which is, from the front door of campus to the Rock Hall of Fame in Cleveland is about 40 minutes. We're surrounded by Amish folks and very sad Cavaliers fans. I can say this. This was my experience with Obama getting elected, at least initially. So I had an assignment in my class in 2004 after Bush got reelected, and I asked my students to predict who would be the two nominees in 2008 and who would win. I had about 20 kids in my class, okay? I only had 2 African-American students. The rest were white kids, the vast majority of whom would often privately say things to me like, oh my gosh, I've never had a black professor before, blah, blah, blah. There were no black people on my high school football team, that sort of thing. I was used to it. I was in Ohio. So the interesting thing is about 6 out of the 20 students predicted that Obama would be the nominee and that he would get elected. And so when I remember handing the assignments back, I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen. And they're like, no, Dr. Johnson, it is. And I was like, you go home and you tell me that your parents and your aunts and your uncles in Sandusky and in Lorain, Ohio, and in Central Ohio are going to vote for a black guy with a middle name that sounds like somebody who we have defined as a dictator and a terrorist supporter for the last 25 years, right? I didn't think it was possible. I got a lot of snarky emails in 08, I will tell you that, because all those kids remembered and they wrote me. So what it spoke to is, as several of you guys have mentioned, obviously young people and young white people were okay with Obama getting elected, or at least saw some sort of virtue signaling benefit to that occurring. Mind you, those same young white people are now Trump supporters. It's the same people. Obama getting elected allowed them to act upon the sort of rage and envy and jealousy that they've always had. I've always said this, Obama didn't change one racist in America. He didn't change anyone's attitude, he just offered a better deal. And so the same sort of racial hostilities that existed, I say that sort of current generation of white kids, Donald Trump is old to them. You ask them who the greatest business person is and they'll say it's Diddy. They'll say it's Jay-Z. And then they had Obama. So they're like, well, what are black people complaining about? Right? That's their attitude. So they vote for Trump because Trump is, and I know we didn't want to get too much into this, but Obama and Trump sort of lead together because he's a temper tantrum against what Obama represented. And so the moment that he got into office, I remember, I was nominally excited. I mean, I wasn't jumping up and downs like Chris Rock said. I didn't get an Obama Prize in the mail. Like nothing changed for me, right? But I was like, this will be interesting. And within a year of him getting elected, I literally was emotionally exhausted in watching on the national stage the kind of day-to-day microaggressions and active aggressions and racism that every black professional deals with in our personal lives, and then we got to see Obama go through it. It was exhausting. It was exhausting to see the way that Congress dealt with him. It was exhausting to see Joe Wilson, because that's what black people deal with every single day. And so, I saw a lot of sort of symbolic value in him getting elected. But as Ibram has mentioned, as other people, I saw the rise and the sort of emboldening of racism as well when he got into office. And both because of his actual constraints in office, because of some of the president's own belief systems, and because of the world, just the demographic world we were dealing in, I don't think he always even could have anticipated how much backlash there was to him getting elected. And I think we're dealing with that.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that backlash. And let me go back to Ibram, because I know you point out what a possible parallel between the Civil War and now. So we get the presidency of Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation and the Civil War amendments, followed by the presidency of Andrew Johnson and the destruction of Reconstruction, and then the Jim Crow era. And the Obama presidency has been followed by someone who I make some historical parallels with Andrew Johnson and Trump. They're both kind of preemptive presidents, trying to restore the country to where it was before the advances that we saw during the Civil War and the early Reconstruction period, and during the Obama presidency. So what are your thoughts about now? How, I don't know, how concerned are you that we're in this another one of these dark periods that could perhaps last a long time if that parallel holds up?
And so, I think it's, I don't know if good is the right word, but the fact that we as a nation, or we're even talking about these parallels and we're comparing them to what's happened in history. And just to give an example of Andrew Johnson, in 1866, as you know, he vetoed the first civil rights bill, basically making the case that it was discriminating against white people. And that, of course, would become a very similar line that was used to justify the progression of racism, whether it's through the mass disenfranchisement of black voters by the end of the 19th century, because apparently there was all this voter fraud in which they had ruined this harmonious South, or whether it was massive resistance to, again, the harmonious nation in which everything was beautiful and separate and equal, or whether, you know, what's happening now. And so I think it's critical for us to see that parallel, right? And to recognize how, if we were looking from the standpoint of history, we would have figured that a Donald Trump would follow a Barack Obama, because that's indicative of American history. I don't say this often publicly because people don't believe people who say this, but
go for it.
You know, I was telling my friends and family members that this guy has a great chance at winning, and everybody thought I was crazy. Because when you look at what he was speaking to, when he was speaking to it, it became pretty obvious that either he was a genius or he'd done a lot of focus groups with particular groups who would be critical in swinging this election. And that's precisely what happened, combined with voter suppression.
Sure, Jason.
Oh, no.
Oh, I thought you were raising.
Yeah, I was just saying he was right.
Yeah, I always call it students who raise their hands. I wonder if we could move to religion, because it's not surprisingly, racial intolerance is often inextricably connected to religious intolerance. So when these, I don't call them neo-Nazis, when these Nazis marched through grounds in August of 2018 when I was in my office, they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and "blood and soil." And I could just imagine what my grandfather, how he would have reacted to that, about going, reversing history in just the most horrible of ways. So I wanted to ask you, David, who studied religious tolerance and liberty and been active in trying to advance it, religious liberty, about our present state of religious intolerance. How much of it this is due to the Trump presidency, or these long-standing developments, as we were describing before, with racial tensions?
Look, across the globe, there has been a significant decline since 2005 of human rights, of democracy, of religious freedom, and these all go hand in hand, and large percentage of the world lives facing significant restrictions on their ability to live out their lives in the most basic ways, to openly celebrate their religion, to organize for church, their houses of worship in whatever form that they want, to run their religious lives without threats from the outside, either from the government or social forces. In America, thankfully, the picture is very different. There is still a high degree of religious tolerance in America and a high degree of religious freedom. Right now, we're facing something we hadn't faced before, and that is tension between those who claim religious freedom rights and the fundamental protections of civil rights in this country, for all the protected categories, including growingly the LGBTQ community. That's created challenges for us. But to go where I think you're asking, I want to separate that important but limited debate from the rise of white nationalism in this country. And, you know, white supremacy, white nationalism cross over, but they are distinct things in our effort to focus on the enormous growth in anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish hate crimes in this country. Let's never forget that people of race, the hate crimes against them have always been higher than any religious group, and white supremacy is its own thing. It is at the core of racism in this country. Here in a more what feels benign form of white privilege, it is at the core of racism in this country. But the manifestation of white nationalism, targeting all kinds of groups, and often anti-Semitism being at the core of that, is a phenomenon that has greatly intensified in this country. If you look at either the government stats or the ADL stats, the number of anti-Semitic crimes, acts of hatred in this country have doubled since 2016, in both 2017 and 2018 here, and we're up 50% and doubled from 2015. And acts against violence doubled from last year to this year against Jews. So this is a very dangerous time here. But in the end, no group is going to be safe if any group can be victimized. And no one will ever be safe until we deal with racism in this country. It is the original sin. It remains the great form of discrimination and persecution in this country. And any attempt to deal with all the other isms has to always take that into consideration.
Yeah. You mentioned that, thank you. You mentioned that slavery is the original sin in American politics, and this was the theme of Frederick Douglass's rightly famous July 4th, I almost said, when you get as old as me, you rifle through the centuries, 1852 oration. And one of the things that's been interesting, we can move a little bit ahead here to the 2020 election maybe and talk about some of the conversations going on, has been the discussion about reparations, the policy response to this idea of original sin, redemption through some kind of policy. And this has been in academic discussions for a while, but maybe I'm wrong, Jason. Maybe I'm going to turn to you here. But you're the campaign person on the panel. But is this new? And does it mean anything?
It's not new. I mean, there have been policies and bills that John Lewis and several people in Congress have been talking about for over 30 years. There are plenty of academics who've taken a look at reparations. But we have to understand reparations both as a practical matter and then as a sort of a campaign element in 2020. Now, as a practical matter, you have to look at it in terms of how likely is it to occur, because the polling is really misleading, right? Polling for reparations, even amongst black people, tends to be fairly low, because no black person thinks that white people are ever going to do it. I mean, come on, nobody believes that. You can't. Bill Clinton only vaguely said he was sorry for slavery. You can't get police unions to say they're sorry for shooting black people in broad daylight for trying to buy a sandwich at Walmart, right? So does anyone actually believe that white America is going to take any sort of collective responsibility for their behavior towards black people? No, most people don't think that's going to happen. So it doesn't tend to poll well, right? But if you actually ask people, do you think that African Americans are entitled to some sort of recompense in a functional, practical way, most people privately, personally, I don't care if you're talking to a farmer in a barbershop, will say yes. I was walking across campus and I saw, we're building this monument to, enslaved people who built the campus. And there's all these photos of sort of former slaves and things. And I remember thinking to myself, it was just earlier today, I was like, wow, that's impressive. It doesn't account for much. It doesn't account for, lack of diversity in faculty. It doesn't account for structural racism one way or another, but it's a nice symbolic step in that direction. And that's kind of how people tend to look at reparations. I'll also say this very quickly as a campaign issue. There are, and I don't want to go down this conspiratorial hole, but there are people who will use the idea of reparations as a wedge issue to depress or alienate black voters, okay? You have certain individuals online in social media environments who are being sort of enhanced and given a higher profile, sometimes by right wing, sometimes by Republican forces, sometimes possibly by external forces, in order to make reparations a litmus test issue. Okay? These people also tend to be linked with hard right elements and black identity issue people who are also against, immigrants and everything else like that. So we have to understand that reparations as an academic or a policy issue is different from how it's being talked about now. And I promise you that the president will at some point bring it up, probably even before 2020, as a way to sort of remind white America that the Democrats are the party of Black Lives Matter, queers, and dreamers. And they're going to give all this stuff back to black people, and the only way to stop that from happening is keeping me in office.
Ibram, in your book, you put a lot of emphasis on policy and the importance of anti-racist policy. And this, I agree with everything. I'm totally down with everything that Jason said, but this is not just pie in the sky. Germany has had a substantial reparations policy for Holocaust victims. So I wonder what you think about reparations. Is this, at least thinking about it, imagining it, is it an anti-racist policy? Is it something that needs to be discussed? As dangerous as that might be politically?
So, very quickly, I define an anti-racist policy as any policy that creates racial equity or reduces racial inequity. One of the most searing and destructive racial inequities that exists today is the racial wealth gap. How do you reduce, close, eliminate the racial wealth gap without reparations?
Nobody's jumping to answer that.
Well,
because you can't.
And I think following on that, there's a question about framing of reparations that I think is really important. My thought about whether it's a substantive policy issue that's going to have traction, I agree, it probably will not. But I think a way to reframe reparations is to move beyond reparations as a form of, and I think this is how many white people approach this, or good liberals as well. They start with the practical question. Many things aren't practical that we've managed to do in this country, by the way. But we need to think about reparations as a form of justice. And recognize reparations is not retributive justice. It's not punishment or vengeance, because if black people wanted to hurt y'all, we would have done it a long time ago. It's not, I'm serious, it's not redistributive justice. It's not a welfare payment. It's also not a form of material, primarily even material. It's not going to close the wealth gap, right? It should be reframed as a form of restorative justice, righting wrongs. And America has not got the political will to right its wrongs. That's why Clinton barely apologized for slavery. And so the issue is that the same folks who talk about being strangers in their own land already feel like someone cut in line who earned their way. And so it's really about the framing of reparations. Go back and watch The Birth of a Nation from 1914. 40 acres and a mule is reparations. And the film is about, it's all about disenfranchising those who are getting somewhere in the political world, Black Americans.
It's a glorification of the Ku Klux Klan, and it was a huge hit. And it wasn't just a hit in the South.
No.
It was a hit all over the country.
But it was also an assertion. It was an assertion about where blacks stand in the pecking order, right? Failed citizens is what that film was saying. If you go back to the scene in the South Carolina State House, the idea is all black people do is eat fried chicken and gaze at white women in the gallery. And that trope persists to this day. Right? I mean, we can be graphic about what the trope is and how it plays out in our popular culture. This is America. There are artists doing wonderful things, reminding us that these tropes, these old tropes, persist. The old minstrel tropes persist to this day. They have policy consequences. And the construction of Black Americans, particularly as failed citizens, means that the reparations issue will go nowhere. And Obama was a reification of that notion in people's heads. The black man in the White House, and now we got to take America back, right?
We got it, David.
I mean, I think that there's a good deal of truth to that. There certainly was a strand in America that said, look, if Obama can make it, then anyone can make it, and it's just a question of not trying hard enough here rather than dealing with the structural issues here. Just to be clear what we're talking about here, the average white family in this country, Caucasian family, compared to the average black country, has 14 times the amount of wealth as the average black family does, 11 times the amount of wealth of a Latino family in the United States. When 2008, whenever there's a reversal, it always affects the minority communities more because they're simply more vulnerable, have more at risk all the time about it. So the hits in 2008 to 2012 were enormous in the minority communities. And this is due to a whole range of structural things. Here, you know, perhaps, maybe I'm fooling myself here, but I teach for the last 40 years at Georgetown University. The student body there came to grips in a fascinating debate about what reparations required. And for me, as a Jew who's taught in order to have, when you sin, to have forgiveness, you have to acknowledge what happened, you have to try and make it right, and you have to change things so it won't happen again. Change yourself and things around you so it won't happen again. I believe it is possible. It is a failure of moral vision and political will to do it. Just think about this, just if you think it's impossible to do. Put aside all the questions, who gets it, who doesn't get it, what form it comes in, et cetera. If you count the 2 million veterans at the end of World War II and their families, it is the same proportion of America that African Americans are today. And the GI Bill and the FHA loan programs lifted to the middle class almost that entire segment of the country. Here, it really can be done if we have the moral vision and the political will to do it. And until we make it right, to as best we can, knowing nothing will be perfect, it will be a scar that wounds the entire nation over and over again. So I'm really, you know, this is a time when these resolutions going through Congress about creating a commission that would be the right, I hope, the right kind of commission here to actually focus on this and come up with different approaches to this. I think that is needed today more than ever, and I really hope that goes through and it begins to, and it's implemented.
You know, it's... Go ahead, please.
If I could just say something briefly as well. I think another problem is I don't think Americans have been truly taught about the extent of wealth that was generated as a result of slavery. And so in 1860, slaveholders were the wealthiest group of people, not in the United States, but in the world. And we also have a segment of Americans who at least say publicly that the Confederate States of America were about just maintaining states' rights, not protecting the most lucrative investments in land and people in the world, not creating a mechanism in which they could spread the slaveholding territory to the South, to South America. That was the sort of grand plan. And we also aren't taught, we're taught about lynching somewhat, but we're not taught about how many black landowners were driven from their property in the late 1900s, early 2000s. And of course, you know, to echo the way in which black people received the old deal, we didn't receive any new deal. And then now we're seeing all of these reports in which banks are continuously discriminating against black people who want to go about purchasing a home, which of course in this country is the way in which most people build wealth. And so this isn't just about slavery. I mean, this is about what has consistently happened in this country, in which all of these racist policies have intersected to fundamentally suppress black wealth and even black incomes. And so it's taken an accounting even of what's happening right now, which I think people are just unwilling to do. And I should also add that one of the forms of resistance against reparations is because it will not only open up the door to the history of racism, but it'll open up the door to the history of other forms of bigotry that I think people are scared about too, in which there are many different groups of people who were denied access to economic opportunity, whether it's Irish people in the 1900s, I should say 1800s, whether it's Southerners compared to Northerners. I mean, we can go down the list of people, but ultimately, we have so many gaps in inequities in this country, and the fundamental question has always been, is it the result of policies or those people being inferior? And it's always been the result of policies.
Thank you. All right, we're going to go to Q&A now, and two of my excellent students are in the audience, and they're going to ask some questions. I can't see them, but oh, there you are.
Thanks again to the panelists. Recently, the chair of the Republican National Committee minimized the role of the president as a moral leader on CNN, stating that she goes to church for her moral leadership. What are your thoughts about the president as a moral compass for America, and is it important for the president to leverage religion in order to fill that role?
So, Larissa, do you want to? I have to. This is so fun.
I'm taken aback by not just this question of morality, the question of whether or not we should or should not look to whether it's sports figures or actors or presidents for moral leadership. I think the important question is, who are we as a country and who are we becoming? I mean, the essence of this panel was about national identity. And what the Obama presidency showed, it sparked this movement called the Tea Party, lest we forget. And the essence of that movement was to play into nativist, racist, bigoted, not fears, but again, tropes that underlie the founding of this country. White supremacy constructs race. And colonialism and capitalism were perpetuated via the vehicle of Christianity. So lest we forget who gets framed in, who counts a citizen, and who doesn't, always comes back to this narrative about our underlying values, which are often erroneously termed Judeo-Christian. And so to the extent that Americans do look to presidents to be, there's a famous taxonomy in the study of the presidency. Some look to the presidency as a savior figure, as a messiah figure, as was mentioned earlier, especially in times of trouble and turmoil in our country. It is important to advance accountability. And I think part and parcel of that is thinking hard about who we are as Americans. And the fact that the construction of Americanness, and this is a statistic, one of the questions we didn't get to talk about was the immigration debate. About 56% of Republicans and 63% of Trump primary voters considered Christianity essential to citizenship. So all Donald Trump has to do is Johnny come lately, say 2 Corinthians, right? And he's anointed, holy water, dunked, whatever. Take your pick, right? So I find that troubling, and so yeah.
So there's another thing. The president is not just, obviously the president is moral leadership and everything else like that, but the president is also at the core of sort of how white supremacy functions in this country. He is the ultimate man, and a large part of white supremacy is also patriarchy and worship of a very sort of generic notion of heterosexual white manhood, right? You have to understand the presidency in that regard. He's the ultimate man. He's the man that people want to be. Part of explaining why our country is where it is today is because in order to understand what that man is in the presidency, you have to understand that in our music and our songs, that America is a woman. America dated a black guy for 8 years, and a lot of white guys aren't happy about it. Let's just be clear. That's what happened. and she's still talking about him, right? Every time they talk on TV. And so, Donald Trump represents that angry white man, that white guy who feels emasculated. And I'm talking about people who voted for Obama, who still feel a little emasculated. That this guy and his attractive family and his kids and Charlize Theron thought he was so cute and all these other people, they don't deal with that very well. So a president is not just a religious leader, he is a symbolic leader for a certain kind of white manhood that drives this country. That's why you can see all these laws being passed in Ohio and everything's like, no, 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 no. We have to control white women's bodies because if we let them go, they're gonna go for a black guy, right? No, 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 no. We have to stop all these gay people because they make us feel weak as straight white men, right? That's where all this stuff comes from. That's why you can have evangelical Christians voting for a guy who consistently cheats on his wife with adult film stars. Right? Because it's about recapturing this notion of supposedly lost masculinity. And so that's what our presidency represents. That's the hurdle that women face when they run for president of the United States. And I think to the degree that anyone doubts that these things are at play and that these issues are so fundamental, they're beyond policy, they're beyond economics, consider the fact that you have consistently in these sort of alt-right groups, and really they're just Nazis. They're like Forever 21 Nazis, right? They just clean up their act and they're trying to rebrand it. Notice that one of their biggest insults to each other is to call someone else a cuck, which is short for cuckolding. It's the idea that you're not a real man, that you have been shamed and embarrassed by an other. And that's what drives so much of this rage, so much of this anger. That's where you get these incels from. They are essentially very, very, very concerned that what it is to be a white man has been taken from them. And at the core of America, we're not a Christian country, we worship white people. That's what the whole country's been about. And to the degree that Trump can continue doing that, that's why he can remain successful.
Let's get another question. Rainer?
Right here. Many scholars and practitioners have described the U.S. as an incarceral state in which Black Americans especially are disproportionately prosecuted and jailed. Do you think this so-called incarceral state is the most direct form of institutionalized racism in the United States today, and what can be done to combat this given the fragmented nature of the American justice system?
You want to take this one? Catch this one?
So I think the question was, is it
it's
the
about
most...
the carceral state, yeah. Is it
the
worst form
direct?
of institutional racism?
I think it certainly has become, if anything, the sort of poster child for racism particularly over the last 8 years. I would probably say that the singular form of racism in this country exists within healthcare. And when you look at health disparities and the number of people who, because they're Black, because they're a Black woman, because they're a Black man, who die every year, not are incarcerated, but who literally are dying because Black people are 25% more likely to die of cancer or this or that, I think that is the most searing form of racism, and I would say it probably always has been. Basically, who lives and who dies. And who lives and who dies is based on race in this country, and it always has been. And I think that, but that's not to take anything away from mass incarceration, which of course, when you have a nation in which 40% of the incarcerated population in this country is Black, even though Black people make up 13% of the population, when you have people who imagine that because of the color of a person's skin, they're dangerous because of, I'm coming through a neighborhood in which there's many people who are people of color, it must be a dangerous neighborhood. When Americans don't realize that the vast majority of people in this country during the mass incarceration era were incarcerated due to drug crimes. But studies have shown that white people are more likely to sell and consume drugs. And what Americans don't realize this, and constantly imagine that to be black is to be dangerous, and to be dangerous is to be black, which is why if a white person with a rifle walks into my place, I'm not going to necessarily be scared. Or if that person kills dozens of white people, he's still going to be, the cops are still going to apprehend him without touching him. I mean, this is the type of nation that we live in. And I think you have so many people who don't live in that reality. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just tragic, how you have so many people who don't live in reality.
Yeah. Yeah. So much of this has been depressing, but the truth is often depressing. So can I ask the rabbi to give what is it called at the end? It's not the invocation, it's the invocation. Is there anything to be optimistic about in these times?
Since we're coming to the end, just indulge me to make a couple of comments that I didn't have a chance to make before. I'm deeply alarmed by what the president has done. If our friend Jim Wallace is fond of saying, if Abraham Lincoln called us, America, to its better angels, this president seems to be calling us to our worst demons. He has lifted the cultural, social, political constraints on certain kinds of rhetoric in public life here that have been left on the fringes for much of the time since the end of World War II that made America a better place here, and has given energy to those extremist voices and actions in America, because violent speech, dehumanizing speech leads inevitably to people acting on that in ways that target the most vulnerable and the victims in our country. Here, and I'm deeply alarmed by the splits in this country. They're deep. They are really deep. If you look at the polls that divide America into two, do you tend to vote Republican and Democrat, that Nork and Gallup and PRRI do, the differences are stunning, stunning. Here, 2/3 of Democratic voters think our growing diversity is good. 2/3 of Republican voters think it's not good. 2/3 of Americans think, Democratic voters think there's serious discrimination against African Americans, Muslims, immigrants, LGBTQ community. Here, less than 1/3, sometimes less than 20% of Republican voters feel that. But 43% of Republican voters think there's serious discrimination against whites in America. 48% of Republican voters think there's serious discrimination against Christians in America. These are two different worlds that we're dealing with, and those divisions are being driven. Now, having said that, when you look at the young cohorts, across the board. I mean, you can take evangelical Christians, the younger cohort on gay marriage, on a range of social issues, not abortion, that remains the same. It's there. So the young are voting more for more liberal candidates. They are voting, their attitudes are more open and willing to do it. And, we're at a moment in history where we have to deal in America, and we're seeing this. The very fact we're having these kinds of discussions, if we don't address the issues of white privilege and male privilege and straight privilege here, and what has been done to, we've talked about the African American community, but I also want to name Native Americans, because the sins there are equally so in their own way. Here. Young people, and what happened at Georgetown testifies to this. Young people are open. They want to address it. They feel that we don't have to be the prisoners of a bitter and unremitting past. We can be. We will be. We must be the shapers of a better and more hopeful future. And they're there, and we need to support them in this to make the kind of difference America needs.
I hate to end this because this has really been interesting, and I'm very hopeful after spending time with you four on this stage. I wish we had more time. You guys have been great. Thank you so much. And will you join me in thanking our great panelists?